10 years ago, I was the police chief in Arlington, Virginia. It's a community of about 190,000 people, and it contains within its boundaries, obviously, Arlington National Cemetery, but it also contains the Pentagon. And on September 11th, I was in Atlantic City giving a lecture on the issue of racial profiling, which is a very big issue, and there's a big conference going on. And it, about 9 o'clock in the morning, the superintendent of state police tells us the World Trade Center has been attacked. So obviously, my car was already packed up. My first thought is, okay, it's Washington, D.C. next. And no longer did I have that terrible thought. Then he makes an announcement at about 9:30 in the morning that the Pentagon had just been struck by an airliner. So without any further ceremony, I jumped in my cruiser and left Atlantic City. Now, the miracle for me was I'd been offered an air flight and had just decided on a whim to take my cruiser because I thought, if something happens in the middle of the night, one of my guys gets hurt and I want to get home. There's no airplanes at Atlantic City in the middle of the night. Well, there wasn't any American air traffic, as you know, and a number of chiefs got stranded there trying to get home. But nobody needed to get home more than I did. So I got on the expressway, and I literally pulled over a New Jersey state trooper, identified myself, said, get a look at my plate number. I'm not stopping until I get to Washington, D.C. So just, radio ahead, I'm just going. And I covered 200 miles in about 2.25 hours. It was the most stressful time of my life because obviously I wanted to be in Arlington. The difficulty was no cell phones worked. Immediately all the cell phones were tied up and you could not make a cell phone call in metropolitan Washington, D.C., probably most of the East Coast. So I really didn't know up to the moment anything except what I was hearing on the news radio station as I barreled down Route 95. I was able to console myself with the following. We had the week before, a big part of being a good chief executive is saying yes when somebody has a good idea. The week before I'd said yes to someone who had the idea to do an update on our command training on incident command. And we had done it. We trained on it periodically. What's unique about the Washington, D.C. area is that local government down there is fairly large and sophisticated. I don't know if any of you have lived down there for any period of time, but you've got the district, and down there the engines of local government in Maryland and in Virginia are the counties. All right, so it'd be like the only government in Milwaukee was Milwaukee County government. That's how Arlington was, that's how Fairfax County is, that's how Montgomery County is. So over the course of all the time I had been there, and certainly, since Washington, D.C. had been ground zero all through the Cold War, all of these agencies had developed a habit of working together and training with their federal colleagues. Our fire department was fairly closely connected to the regional fire departments, and our police department did constant interagency training on SWAT, on emergency response, on incident command, and it verifies it in the commission report. There was probably no other area in the country better prepared for a critical incident than Metro D.C. was, just because of its history. So at any rate, I knew the organization was ready to step up to the emergency, but the anxiety was, that's my police department, a terrible thing is happening, I need to be there. I got there about 2.5 hours later. The smoke was still pouring out of the Pentagon. We'd already done one evacuation. We were going to do 2 more because of false alarms. But the remarkable thing, and this is something I'll never forget, is how much responsibility was delegated to local government that day. I mean, this was the Pentagon. This was the heart of the nation's defense. On any other day in American history, it would have been the most massive thing that ever happened in our borders. And the point was that the people inside the Pentagon, from moments after the airliner hit the the West Wing of the Pentagon, basically said Arlington County is in charge of outside the building. And that was a remarkable understanding. And even though I got there, 2 hours late for the attack, the point was so many things still needed to be done. I mean, there was no perimeter fence. There was no fortifications around the Pentagon. People have in their minds that, of course the Pentagon has hundreds of MPs armed with M16s. The answer to that is no, they didn't. They had my guys and gals armed with .40 caliber pistols. That was security outside the Pentagon for the better part of the first 24 hours. So our challenge was to do a number of things very rapidly in concert with the fire department. The Arlington County Fire Department was the incident commander at the Pentagon. And something to keep in mind, because I got involved in a lot of post 9/11 planning, particularly after I became Secretary of Public Safety. No matter what kind of international terror attack ever takes place in the United States, it's going to be a local government responsibility. All right? No other nation on earth delegates as much responsibility to local government as the United States does. Okay? And so the incident commander was the fire department. And the site security and the crime scene protection and the traffic control and the crowd control and the evidence recovery was being led by the Arlington County Police Department. So a key issue, obviously, is what is the capacity of local government to do this in any given area? All right? In D.C., we are at a relatively higher level of capacity just because of the way government is organized around there, and we were a higher level of mutual aid and coordination. In a lot of other parts of the country, and that capacity wasn't there or would not be there in a similar situation just because there are so many local government jurisdictions. At any rate, we would be there for 11 days. And it was probably the hardest work we ever did in terms of straightforwardly continuing to develop security plans for the Pentagon. I mean, keep in mind, when we first got there was no credentialing system, i.e. who belonged inside the perimeter of what's this massive crime scene. Our first credentialing system was basically the little wristbands you get if you leave a nightclub and you want to get back in because you've paid the cover charge. I mean, that's what we had. All right. Now, mercifully, within about 8 hours, Secret Service was there with laminates and photographs and all kinds of fancy credentialing. But initially, we had to set up what the credentialing would look like on the grounds of this place where the terror attack took place. The second thing, and again, the 9/11 Commission makes it clear, is that not only did we have strong regional partnerships, the county government itself had a very strong comprehensive emergency management plan, and that enabled us to get a lot of resources through the county without our incident commander really having to think about where it would all come from. And that, coupled with the Defense Department's ability to bring in assets from elsewhere, really got the recovery efforts jump-started. Now, a couple things, I'm doing stream of consciousness here because it's all coming back. A couple of things to keep in mind is this was a really dangerous fire. Okay, people don't realize, a lot of people don't realize the Pentagon, the groundbreaking for the Pentagon was September 11th, 1940. Weird little factoid we would find later. But at any rate, the inside of the Pentagon, up when the red roof goes all the way there on the outside of the Pentagon, was lined with plaster and horsehair. And the fire got up into the roof. And so the challenge ultimately for the fire department and why they needed so much site security for so long is they couldn't get it under control immediately because the fire was moving along the roof line away from the crash scene, but towards all these really important places that needed to be maintained open. Now, one thing Secretary Rumsfeld made clear is he wanted that thing open for business on September 12th. And other than that, the only interest of the Pentagon was finding out who did it and killing them. And it was up to us and our mutual aid partners to create an environment in which they could keep the building open, we could keep the fire under control, and we could keep the external environment safe. because there was a lot of crazy people wandering around at that point in time trying to penetrate the security zone. The other thing to keep in mind is when the plane hit the Pentagon, even though it killed 125 people, that part of the Pentagon was capable of holding 800. And the only reason it wasn't holding 800 is it had just been renovated and was at that point the physically strongest point in the Pentagon. If you look at the initial pictures of the impact, you can see that even though the building has started to collapse, none of the windows are broken. They were all blast resistant, and you can see the red I-beams poking out where it had just been reinforced. And the fact is, if it had not just been renovated, it's very likely that plane would have gone right through the West Wing and into the east side of the Pentagon. And what you have to understand is exactly opposite where the plane hit, on the riverside, is the offices of the Secretary of Defense and all the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So theoretically, if that plane hit just on the precise opposite side of the building, it would have decapitated our defense leadership. So it was a near-run thing that day. After the initial fire was tamped down around the plane, the hardest work for us was recovering evidence. This was a very gruesome business and very painful, and probably for the officers, the most stressful after the initial 24 hours of security when we didn't know if there were going to be secondary or follow-up attacks. And that was, all of the rubble had to be extracted from the wound in the building, had to be transported to a parking lot nearby, put into piles, and then the piles were spread across the parking lot. And it was the responsibility of my officers to go through the rubble looking for body parts, pieces of aircraft, classified material, and any other evidentiary material that they might find. They did it under the supervision of the FBI, but it was our officers that were doing the physical labor. And it was in that context that they recovered personal effects from the terrorists, one of whom was named Hani Hanjour. And the reason that name sticks by me is from the rubble we recovered the receipt that indicated that he had recently paid a ticket in Arlington for speeding, which again kind of doubles back to a lot of the tension post 9/11, which was from local government's point of view. We realized we'd be likely the people most likely to come in contact with a potential terrorist, and therefore the ability to exchange information from the federal government to the local governments was something we felt was critical. It took us a long time to get a handle on. I guess I'm kind of stream of consciousness right now, but those are some of the big picture stuff we were involved in. Having said all that stuff, maybe that triggers some questions or items of curiosity you might have about what that was like.
How long were you on scene reporting to the Pentagon, going through the evidence and all of that?
We were there for 11 days. And I have to say, the interesting thing was, and I say this, and it's critical you understand this, this is not, a bad thing. But what was stunning to me was once the event occurred, the senior leadership of the Pentagon pretty much turfed the external environment off to us. All right, they got themselves busy about arranging logistical support for repairing and shoring up the building, and they focused on their mission. All right, when I say the incident commander was the fire chief, that's not hyperbole. All right, if you look at pictures of the press conferences right after the attack, it's our fire officials that are there saying when they think the building can reopen. And when General Jackson from Joint Forces Command came to the police department's incident command bus, his point was, what can I do to help? All right, and it was a total liaison situation. We never received a directive, do this, don't go here. Their expectation was that we would organize the defense of the Pentagon with our mutual aid partners, and they would take care of their business. And that's really the way it worked out. And that's, as I say, that's the powerful lesson that was under-articulated post 9/11, which was this is really about local government. Now, I know we we created a federal Department of Homeland Security, and we talked a lot about the federal law, the federal role. But at point of contact, the people who show up first are us. And if that can be true at a location such as the Pentagon, well, it's even more so at any other likely target in the United States. So that was the remarkable feeling, was how much responsibility I had implicitly been delegated, by the Defense Department. I mean, that was essentially it. The fire chief and I were delegated responsibility. You go do that. We're not asking about it. We're not following up. You go take care of us. You protect us. You get the fire out. We've got business to take care of. And that sense of empowerment, I think, in many ways was an inspiration to the police officers and firefighters that were at that location.
And going through all of that debris, was there a physical and emotional toll on all the officers?
Absolutely. One of the things we did, it may have been the decision I felt best about, and I made a lot of decisions over the course of 11 days, but the decision I felt best about was on the 12th day after we had broken down our incident command and turned the site over. We organized a family day. And what that was is we found a location where, there were balloons and cakes and sodas for the kids. But for the officers and their spouses, we set up a series of PTS, post-traumatic stress debriefings. All right, we set up a series of employee assistant programs debriefings. We basically told everybody, you have been nonstop feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders for the last 11 days. There are consequences for this kind of behavior and this kind of nonstop stress that will be played out at home. Look for these signs. Look for these symptoms. Be aware in yourself when you're short-tempered. Be aware in yourself when you overreact to small stimuli. Be aware of sleep deprivation and its effect on you. And what was very important is, as my wife attended, and about a week later, I was doing some odd job around the house, and it went awry, which what usually happens when I do odd jobs around the house, and I had a major temper tantrum. I totally lost it, and I had been under complete control for the last 2 weeks. I had no doubts we were going to succeed. Everything's under control. Be calm. I was Mr. Send people home when they're stressed. I was Mr. Everything is under control, and I had this meltdown. And she literally grabbed me by the shirt. She looked at me and she said, I went to the class that you sent me to. I know what you're going through. Stop it. And it helped. It was like cold water. But I mean, okay, I'm not immune either. All right, I've been Mr. Perfect for the last 11 days. I'm feeling the same stuff my boys and girls are feeling. It just feels differently. I'm able to, conceal it a little bit better. That's my job. But I think it weighed on all of us because we intellectually knew that our country had been attacked in our town. Okay? I mean, there were jet fighter planes flying air cover for our recovery efforts. We knew we were at war. We knew we were in the nation's capital, in our backyard, at war, could be attacked again. But we couldn't allow ourselves to dwell on that. We had to dwell on the blocking and tackling of our job. The fire department had to put out a fire, deal with a plane crash, and respond to a building collapse. My coppers had to provide site security, traffic control, crowd control, crime scene protection, and crime scene search services. We had to do our basic job. It didn't matter that it was war. It mattered that we got the blocking and tackling right. So there was this kind of push me, pull you. Every once in a while you'd look up at the sky and there'd be an F-16 and you'd say, crap, this is what's going on right now. And then you had to look down and get back to, okay, who's got this post covered? Who's got this entryway covered? Who's doing this at the search? Have we inventoried the crime scene properly? Are we doing the reports right? How's our liaison with FBI going? How's our liaison with DOD going? And so on. So I think the stress was cumulative, but it's more the accumulation of just hard work, knowing the world was watching. And I think that just creates its own set of stresses over time, separate and apart from the job.
How do those 11 days stick with you now, even today, in your role as police chief here in Milwaukee? I guess what have you learned and how does it kind of translate to what you're doing?
Well, it's affected my thinking in a number of ways. Certainly, When I had a chance to put together a state homeland security strategy in Massachusetts, I absolutely emphasized the necessity of regional approaches, and that we had to also emphasize this notion that when you distribute homeland security funding, it can't be everybody gets a dollar. You know, there's a military dictum that who defends everything defends nothing, that anything we did had to be threat-based, vulnerability-based, and risk-based. And we did that in Massachusetts, and we were the first state to do it that way. In other words, what are our vulnerabilities? What are the things in our state that if something went bad, it would be a really terrible consequence? Second issue then is, what's the risk that something like that would happen? Has it ever happened again? Does it fit with terrorist means and motives? And finally, what is the current threat environment? All right? Are there any credible threats to us? And so in the immediate frenzy of post 9/11, what was happening was everybody was rushing to protect their water power and their sewage plant and their water tower. And my thought was, okay, what do terrorists like to do? Well, in the context of this group of terrorists who were attacking America, they wanted to do grand, monstrous things that would demonstrate America's impotence and play well on TV. Well, blowing up the Manasquan Township water tower wasn't going to do that for them. All right? And so the discussions really had to start centering more realistically around what were the threats to America based on what intelligence and what would be the consequence if that particular thing got injured. Because, my God, you may remember, within days of 9/11, we were being inundated with terrorism experts, each one of whom had a new scenario about how you could wipe out 100,000 people simply by doing A, B, and C. All right? I mean, we just instantly had an industry of terror experts, out there telling us we were all going to die. And that wasn't helping us focus our efforts very well. Second thing I learned is, and I knew this going in, but seeing it as something else, you can really rely on your cops and firefighters to do the right thing under pressure, particularly if you've given them any kind of appropriate training. All right? Our people went there with a plan. I mean, we had the advantage. The Pentagon is an isolated location. We had an advantage. Every year, the Marine Corps Marathon and the Army 10K races start and end at the Pentagon. Okay? Every year, we have to provide some level of presence there because of the 4th of July fireworks. So we knew that spot. It was a home game. And we didn't have a whole bunch of contiguous buildings 1,000 feet in the air that were collapsing around us. Okay? So in some ways, the response was certainly less complex than New York City's. But the point was, we had well-trained people who went there with a game plan. They knew where to go to start with. And if you can eliminate some level of confusion initially, you can begin to guarantee a successful response, okay, because the signals aren't crossed. We didn't have interoperable communications then. Nobody did. So what did? We gave a radio to every agency that was doing mutual aid with us, and they held on to it at their command level, and we told their commanders what we needed. All right, we didn't need to spend $5 million getting interoperability. We were able to compensate for that. The key thing was that the people went there with a plan, and people had worked there together. And everywhere I've been since, that's obviously an issue that we look to. And America is getting better at it, and that is interjurisdictional arrangements and interjurisdictional partnerships. Well, initially we thought it was going to be worse. All right? I mean, I didn't know how many people were on the plane right away. I did know that they had just opened that wing. So my worry was that I knew somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 people could work at each wing. I mean, hell, the Pentagon's got 20,000 people in it every day. So I had no idea how many people were in that wing yet, how many of the offices had been occupied. And our initial potential casualty estimates turned out to be very high, because we were operating on the supposition that more of it was occupied than was. So there were no pleasant surprises that day, but it certainly was, it was better that, 1,000 people hadn't been killed, and that certainly would have been a potential if that wing had been fully occupied, and it wasn't. So the only vague comfort was it could have been worse. Well, certainly, we have absolutely ramped up our ability to both develop and share intelligence with other agencies and our federal colleagues. That capacity just did not exist in September of 2001. Again, when I was secretary in Massachusetts, we developed one of the nation's first fusion centers, which was creating a capacity to start trying to glean from criminal intelligence potential terrorism intelligence. One of the things we found out shortly after 9/11 as we talked to our colleagues in Great Britain and Israel is many of their inroads into breaking up terrorism cells was through the investigation of criminal enterprises involving things like drug dealing, cigarette smuggling, identity theft, and product counterfeiting. All of those are means that terrorist organizations around the world use to fund their terror efforts. It's been true in Palestine. It was true in Northern Ireland that major inroads were made disrupting terrorism by the cops investigating crimes. And so acting on that, we developed a fusion center with the capacity to analyze criminal intelligence with the idea of looking for possible terrorist leads, or at least leads overseas that we could share with our federal colleagues. They became more comfortable sharing intelligence with that intelligence fusion center. Here in Milwaukee, we have developed, I would say, one of the most sophisticated intelligence fusion centers in the country. And by that I just mean it's sophisticated in terms of its strategic approach as well as in terms of the information that it has. It's very tightly dialed into its federal colleagues. We've got a federal presence in our fusion center. Our fusion center people are obviously members of terrorism task forces, but the level of sophistication in terms of information analysis that's available to us here in Milwaukee is far greater than that was available to any police department 10 years ago.